Welcome, Stina.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Just before we kick this off, I just want to say thank you to the Vertical Crypto team for inviting me. And also, I got a little bit of a cold today, so I do apologize if I sound a bit out of breath from time to time. So I'm here today to talk a bit more about what maybe curation means when it comes to crypto art, NFTs, Web3, and so on. But just before I start to talk about that, I think it's always good to introduce yourself. So I am Stina Gustafsson. I am an independent curator and art strategist, and I'm currently based in Copenhagen. I studied culture, criticism, and curation, arts and design at Central St. Martin's in London, and I majored in flux and future thinking within public art practices. I originally worked in the more traditional art world and art market. I've had all kinds of roles, but I've also always had my curatorial practice on the side, so I've always worked as a curator. In 2018, I first started to work with Department of Decentralization, which is a Berlin-based blockchain foundation. And in 2019, I co-founded their art research department, which is also now something that I run on the side. We very much exist within the intersection of art and tech. We like to say that we speak both languages. So we speak a language that the more traditional art world might speak and understand, but also a language that's more suited for a tech-heavier audience. We have released 2 full-length reports on the topic of art and blockchain. The first one was released in June in 2019, and it was called "There is no such thing as blockchain art," and it covered the intersection of blockchain and art back in 2019. We got a lot of pushback on the title. People really thought that we meant that there were no such thing as blockchain art, but of course we were just being ironic. Which is something that we usually are within the projects that we work with. The second one was released in February 2021, and that one was called "Wander Above a Sea of FUD, Cultural Workforce, Crypto-Anarchism, Intellectual Rights, Blockchain, and Blockchain-Based Funding Models for Culture and Arts." So this one here was quite a bit more narrowed down than the first one. These reports have been extremely fruitful for us, and they have really allowed us to start collaborations with artists such as Hito Steril, which we collaborated with earlier this year together with the Bundeskunsthalle in Germany, and also start conversations with other organizations who work with digital art, for example, like Rhizome. So besides the work I do for my clients and what I do together with DoD, I also currently research locational identity online and how this is being portrayed within public art. Both in the physical world, but also as we move more and more online. And this is, of course, quite already a complex subject in today's society, because today's society is in constant flux. And I think as we move online, more and more borders are being erased. And though this is good, it's also kind of create a complex existence with subjects such as locational identity and how you deal with that in relation to communities online, or even when there are no such thing as a community. But I'm not here to speak about myself, but actually about curation, or what perhaps that could mean when it comes to Web3, crypto, blockchain, and other things that we deal with within our industry. But before we go into that, I think it's quite important to look at where it comes from, and also the meaning of the word curation, the role of the curator from a more traditional approach, but also think about what it might mean within our industry. You might have already gone through this if you come from an art practice, but repetition is usually quite good. Just to remember ourselves. So the word curation stems from the Latin word cura, which is directly translated to care and concern. It's the name of the Roman goddess who created the first human. Cura is mentioned in Hyginus' work Fabula, poem 220. the poem got the attention of German philosopher Martin Heidegger. He stated that the double sense of cura refers to care for something as concern, absorption in the world, but also care in the sense of devotion. And I think this is a very interesting quote when I think about curation, as this as a whole is really something that that is important: concern, absorption, and devotion. And of course, I mean, his concept is much more complex than that, but we can also save that for a later discussion. So moving forward to the 2060s, when the modern idea of the role of the curator was starting to shape up. We have some really prominent curators from back then, and I think they all played a very important role to what kind of the role of the curator is today. One, for example, is Clement Greenberg, which is super interesting to research. So during this time, the scope of the role really did widen a lot. Care and concern was definitely still is a part of the role, but it also became much more about translation, conceptualization, ideation, recognition, interpretation, education, evaluation, and so on. And I think also working potentially a lot more closer with artists and kind of the support their practices as well. So for me, it's very much about understanding why and how, not only why an art piece was made, but also why and how it fits within the current situation, why it might be important for the future, why it might be important from an educational point of view, why this is pushing the narrative forward, how it might be reflected upon history, and how it might also fit in within the wider history, how it might help other artists within their practice, how it might challenge current views, and so on. So like these two things, why and how, is always something that I ask myself when I have my conversations around curation with artists, my conversations around the development of exhibitions, and just any kind of general conversation I have around curation. So Web3 curation then. What does that even mean, and how is it actually different from any other curation? So just before we go a bit more into it, and when we talk about a bit more about Web3, I think it's good to just define what I mean when I say Web3. So when the internet started, we had Web 1. The internet we currently have now, which is the big internet, the big tech internet, is Web 2. And with that one, we have big tech such as Facebook, Google, and so on. Basically centralized internet. So what we are working on right now is Web 3. And this is the next and the new iteration of the internet. And if everything goes according to plan, touch wood, it will also be decentralized, which means that there won't be a few big companies that owns it, but ownership will actually be distributed. So let's hope we do it right. But also when you say Web3, many people associate that with decentralized curation. It could, of course, be this, but I think it also means much more. I have done some work with where we've had the decentralized process. And to be completely frank, I don't find it easy at all. I find that it usually means that previous expertise, research, and knowledge tend to be not recognized at all, as you are all supposed to be on the same level. No hierarchy is something that I'm usually in favor on. I'm from Scandinavia, so it's a very flat hierarchy kind of society here, or that's at least what we like to think. But it also actually means that previous skills are sometimes written off as something less important, just simply so that everyone can have an equal say. And as human beings, it's just impossible to know everything. We can't, frankly. know everything. So sometimes you have to give a bit more space to someone else because they know something about a subject that you don't know about. Yeah. So what do I think of when I say Web3 curation of crypto, curation of NFT, or curation just in general? So as we move forward with the role of the curator in Web3, there are a few areas I think that are becoming more and more important. They have been pushed forward lately, but I still think that we really need to mention them again. And they are preservation, reflection, and long-term thinking. So when it comes to preservation, there is just so many things being released all the time within the space. It's just a creation of a never-ending white noise, and it's just relentless, and it never stops. And of course, within this white noise, released on marketplaces or as art NFTs on own contracts or any kind of other release when it comes to NFTs, there's definitely a few really, really good and important projects and pieces. But of course, with all this noise being created, there is a huge risk that projects of high quality won't be seen, recognized, remembered, heard, lost, basically. Things are being forgotten quite quickly due to the high turnaround. And with so much happening all the time, it's also very easy to not consider that what we want to preserve for the future. And I think we need to think of that already now, because I think it's easy to just kind of think that it will be fine, but there needs to be an active thinking around what should be presented for the future already. And I think this is a part where the curator actually comes in, and it's actually not too dissimilar from what a more traditional role of the curator would be outside Web3. To be able to identify, to be able to argue for the quality or importance, and also to be able to present and talk about it in a way that allows for the art or the project to step above that white noise. And maybe it's just easier for a curator to recognize something valuable within everything that's going on. And maybe it's also easier for us to take a step away from that hype scenario that still is happening, even though it's calmed down a bit. And really consider pieces for what they are. We also have, this is also something that comes with our job. We need to consider these things. We need to kind of allow ourselves to take that time. And that comes with the research and the understanding and supporting of the projects that are valuable. And I also want to point out that I think that this is something that Vertical Crypto actually really does very well. I think they have time and they have a lot of consideration in the projects that they work with. So again, kudos to the whole Vertical Crypto team for this. And then, of course, reflection and long-term thinking, which very much goes hand in hand for me. And I think these two are extremely important as we move forward with an existence online. What I mean when I say this is that we need to reflect on history to be able to implement long-term thinking for a more sustainable future. And I just want to say, when I say sustainable future, of course, I do reflect upon the environmental impacts, but I also very much want to emphasize about the sustainability of the practice, the humans, the people who are working in it. So when I refer to sustainable futures here, I mainly mean the sustainability of the work that goes on within Web3. So Web3 is quite quick to claim that what's currently being created is better than what we have now. And I think it's perfectly fine to claim this if you know the history and are also able to reflect upon previous mistakes, learnings, failures, wins, old systems, etc. If you're not able to do this, I think it's quite hard to claim then actually also that what's being created is better, because you simply can't compare it, and it's actually quite a big risk that what's being created is an exact copy. And this is again where the curator comes in, as maybe some kind of a guide in terms of previous art worlds, systems as someone that can reflect upon what it means to create systems that might be better for not only the artist, but also the bigger art ecosystem. And of course, this ties directly into long-term thinking and planning for something bigger in the future. If you know the history, then perhaps it's easier for you to take that into consideration when it comes to thinking about strategies for more sustainable systems. And again, this applies to the wider art ecosystem, something that goes beyond the artist and the creator and considers the wider cultural workforce. The current narrative that we see within Web3 system is that everyone can be a curator. And by all means, yes, we can all be curators, just like everyone can be an artist. But I think sometimes when we say that, it refers to quite a narrow scope of the curator as an organizer. And if that's what we are referring to, I don't think that curator is the right word or title, to be honest, but maybe it's more about being a collection builder or, something along those lines, a bit more of an organizer. And I think as we move forward, the role of the curator, or at least as I see it, will, or hope, I guess, is that it will be recognized as a wider role. That is already happening, but I think there is just so much translation that needs to happen, and the curator can actually really help to facilitate this translation and also the innovation, because we can really consider the history of the art world, the audiences that we are catering to, but also the implementation of these new technologies into systems that already exist. We don't need to reinvent the wheel again. So we should actually use some of this understanding that already exists within the space. I see the curator as not only as an exhibition facilitator or as a connection maker, but also kind of a guide that can help to steer these new systems, together with the artist, of course, and anyone else who's working. And maybe we can find a place where there is space for more sustainable innovation that supports bigger ecosystems and not just the individual. This quote from Brazilian educator and philosopher Paulo Freire, pardon for my pronunciation, I know it's absolutely awful. I find this quote very suitable, and though I know he's not referring to curation, but rather building new systems for press, I think it's actually quite suitable. Discovery cannot be purely intellectual, but must involve action, nor can it be limited to mere activism, but must include serious reflection. Only then will it be a praxis. Curation is not a simple, streamlined practice of selecting and organizing to come back to this kind of organization mechanism that is being pushed forward somehow. It's not now, and it's actually never been this kind of a simple role, but it's actually a rather complex one. And it will evolve, and it's certainly evolving right now. It's happening. It's changing a bit. But I think context, activism, reflection are just hugely important and something that curators needs to be aware of. And I actually do think that this is super important for curators in Web3 as well, and curators within crypto and blockchain. And we all just need to be able to know this in depth and to communicate this with the industry that we're working inside. So also just briefly covering a bit the difference between working URL versus IRL, because there is actually quite a big difference. And when I talk about this, I also think about a big exhibition design and a bit of exhibition thinking, because this is of course still huge parts of being a curator. And I mean, this is also some kind of the seen outcomes of being a curator. The exhibition is kind of what's being presented in the public, so you can't ignore it. And I think until recently, the industry as a Web3 industry has existed quite a lot online. COVID, of course, even though we like to think that that's happened a long time ago, still very accurate and still very relevant for us. It is one of the main factors. And also Web3 is just an industry that's natively digital. We already have a huge crowd there that's comfortable with spending their time on the internet. And for them, being online is nothing new, but actually rather just an extension of their life. So therefore, like, existing online within Web3 is just natural. But I want to also say that new media and digital art exhibitions online or in real life is definitely nothing new, and it has an extremely rich history and practice. But I'm not gonna go into that at all. Just very, very briefly, within the area that I live, which is in Copenhagen and just across the bridge in Skåne, in the Swedish area, which happens to have an extremely rich history of digital art. One of the early pioneers, who's unfortunately not super famous, comes from here. Her name is Charlotte Johannesson. She was born in 1943 in Malmö, and she's still very much a practicing artist. She was also included in this year's iteration of the Venice Biennale, which was absolutely great. She started with weaving, but she changed her loom for an Apple computer in 1978 and basically taught herself coding. So the images you see here are from her solo exhibition in Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid, Spain, last year. And again, I am extremely sorry for the pronunciation of that museum name. So this is a very rich history just in this area, which you don't often talk about. We also used to have an art festival called Electrohype, and it was dedicated to digital art and electronic art. It ran for around 20 years, I think, and it started in the 1990s and then got shut down in the 2000s. So unfortunately, it's not around any longer. But here, it seems like it's... Yeah, there we go. There's the image. This is just an installation photo that you can see. And then here is another one as well, Semiotic Investigation into Cybernetic Behaviour Description by Jessica Field. So back to bring it back again to where we are now and maybe how we need to consider this when we build exhibitions. I think we simply need to go beyond the screen. The screen is the tool we use to facilitate art, but also the exhibition itself needs to build a narrative, and that narrative should reach beyond the screen. As an example, this is an exhibition I saw at ACA this year, I believe. Yes, this year, which is the Australian Centre of Contemporary Art in Melbourne. It was called Who is Afraid of the Public Space? And it was about the new phase of public art in Australia and how public art could exist within the dialogue of the very problematic history that Australia has, at the same time as it opens up for new dialogue and new narratives around Australia's contemporary history. This particular section of the exhibition that you see here was called Project Space, the Hoarding, and it was realized by an agency called Sibling Architecture. So, of course, I mean, this is an architecture firm that knows exactly what to do when it comes to design, etc., which should also be acknowledged. But I find it very, very, very fascinating that this use of material is combined with digital pieces, and the narrative is so strongly echoed both in the digital pieces, but also emphasized really by the material that's in the space around them. The screens are important, but they are not static because they become such an extremely weaved into this narrative that they are presenting. So yeah, this whole room is telling the narrative, not just the piece. So this is basically, I think it's interesting here because I think it's interesting to think about a concept where we can use technology to bridge the digital world with the physical world. And for that, we need both elements. We need both the digital and the physical. And I think maybe that the last slide showed a version of where they try to do something like that. Like I said, it's in the previous slide, it's about the narrative, the story, and what's being presented. And it's not only about the piece, but it's very narrative centralized. And I mean, of course, the exhibition was about something very materialistic, but I think also that doesn't mean that we can't learn from it. And maybe also consider these exhibitions as we move forward with our exhibitions in the real world. Because I mean, I think taking these good exhibitions who really work with both digital and physical and get inspired. So reflecting and understanding is, of course, extremely important. And I think we need to get better at that. And I think one good way of doing it is to know history. I know I keep on coming back to that, but I think history is extremely important. I think we can learn from history. And I think that's why I keep on emphasizing on that. And I think we can learn from it by having the conversations both with artists, of course, but also in our case with technologists and developers, and kind of understand a bit more where we come from. I also want to touch briefly on something that I find absolutely fascinating and interesting, which again ties into the exhibition and exhibition design. And that is the experimental layouts versus more traditional layouts online. So basically, I'm looking here at the very current narrative, a bit more specifically at exhibition layout in the recent iterations of what's being called the metaverse, as it's very quite relevant for us. I'm not going again into the history of exhibitions online because it's a subject that we can be here for hours discussing. So quite early again, of course, during the pandemic, we saw some slight experimentation when it came to showing art online. New Art City popped up, and they offered some exhibitions that took a step away from the more conventional layout. And the one that really stuck with me is Eat Me by Alice Juan Chang. This is more of a travel. This exhibition, it's still up. It's like a movement through the red void or the red room. You're basically floating in thin air, and someone is just reading out the directions, such as the one that you can see on the image here, where it says, "There's nothing you need to do in this very moment, including moving through this space." You simply went along for the ride. This exhibition, I think, is a great experimentation, and is one of the better ones because basically it just allowed you to not move in space. And I think moving in space online has proven to be quite complicated, and will continue to be quite complicated as we try to reach wider audiences who are also not used to moving in spaces in metaverse, etc., such as we are. But we have, of course, also seen more traditional recreations of spaces, elements, things basically that we are familiar with. We've seen walls, floors, windows, doors. We've also seen the white cube being recreated online. I wanted to show an example, which is the Museum of Crypto Art. They're also known as MoCA. They have their space in Somnium. Space Colburn is also one-on-one mentor. So if you want to hear more about MoCA, please book a time with him, because he will be so much better at telling you more about specifically what they do and how they work. And actually, to be honest, this space is maybe one of the more experimental ones that has still somewhat of a traditional layout. There are no walls. The art appears to hang in thin air. But like I said, it's still like quite traditional when it comes to the architectural features. Like there's a floor, it's kind of a square room, etc. And that, I don't mean this in a negative sense at all. That's just the way it is. So why do we have this then? Why do we see so much of the more approach, like traditional approach, when it comes to showing art in these kind of recreated spaces online? Well, there are a few good reasons for that. Onboarding is one of them. If we create spaces that people are able to recognize, it is actually more likely that they might want to join as they're familiar with it. It's not scary, basically. And I don't think this is actually really important to consider when we talk about wider audiences, because if we want more people on board, we should also make it easier for them to join. Traditional layouts also indicate social values and accepted behavior within such spaces. If a space looks like real life, then this must mean that you behave the way you would in real life. And I think we all know that people seem to have quite a hard time to behave properly on the internet. So actually implying social values and accepted behavior by design seems to be something that is really, 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 really important within these early stages, because frankly, I don't think we want to open up for any kind of behavior online. They also indicate that what we see here are museums. Basically, they imitate real-life museums. They indicate that these are the new museums, but for the metaverse, Web3, whatever it's called, it's the new big players, the museums of the futures, and they are indeed on the same levels as the one that we have in our real life. I think also we need to mention the limited imagination of the human being. It definitely plays a role. There are very few humans that have the capability of coming up with things who aren't related to the world that we're living in. We can always imagining things and scenarios, but in many cases, when you actually really think about it, it is somewhat related to the physical world in one way or another. And I mean, having these limitations isn't necessarily a bad thing. That's just kind of what it means to be a human being. We are all born with limitations, but that also means that we have the opportunity to collaborate with other people to, get outside and make up for our own limitations. Like I said before, we can simply not know everything or do everything ourselves. We also, of course, have other platforms such as JPEG, which opens up for a more specific curation tailored towards NFTs. And this is from their website, where they say that JPEG allows everyone to create NFT exhibitions regardless of what they own. Flexible layouts allow users to bring attention and value to NFTs through context-focused viewing experiences and new complementary meanings. Basically, they open up a bit more in making just kind of permissionless curation of NFTs. If you have the OpenSea address, you can curate it. They have collaborated with quite a few traditional art world players. They've collaborated with Art Brussels, which is a big art fair in Brussels, as the name indicates. They've also collaborated with Office Import, Punky Gallery in Berlin, and a few other ones, but now that those names completely escapes me. So what you see here is a still from the joint exhibition between Office Import and Punky Gallery. They had artists such as Ham van den Droppel Jonas Lund, Cornelia Solfrank, Rafael Rosendahl, Leah Rea Myers, Latoba Avadon, Kim Asendorf. I think that's all of them. And it's called NFT Net Art, and it was published earlier this year in the spring, I believe, but maybe don't quote me on that. All exhibitions, one thing that's actually really worth mentioning now as well is that all exhibitions that's published on their site now also goes on chain. So basically, kind of what it means is that every exhibition that's being published on JPEG is recorded on the blockchain. And I guess you can kind of say that it creates somewhat of a loose archive, though I don't really know if it's actually archived or just on the blockchain. But it's basically being recorded so that the information isn't lost. It's a slightly more traditional kind of website approach. They have 3 different layouts. Some of them are very straightforward, kind of scroll sideways, and some of them are set out to be a bit more museum-esque, like the one here, even though this is only a still. It's still a JPEG. It's still a JPEG, basically. So it doesn't really give you an idea, but the exhibition is still up, so you can go and visit it later on. So just to show these 3 alternatives, New Art City, Mocha, and JPEG, there are definitely different ways of curating online as well. And I really don't think that there is one right answer as we move forward, but we need to consider the aim of the exhibition, the experience that we want to present, the narrative that's being presented, the pieces that we're working with, both on an individual level, but also in a group scenario. And I think as human beings, we are usually quite guilty of trying to find kind of a one-size-fits-all scenario. But it usually doesn't end well when we try to do that. And actually, one-size-fits-all is just kind of a lie that we've been told for a long time. And I don't think that is a route that we should even try to go down, but I think we should actually keep it experimental. Life is more complicated. Art is more complicated than that. One size does not fit all. And I think all these 3 examples fills an important function. And I hope that we see more of these ones in the future as the space and the art and the technology develops. So where are we now? And where might we even be going? I think we are at a point where reflection and long-term thinking needs to be 2 things that we just kind of do by default. It needs to be there, present in everything we do, full stop. This kind of endless projects, endless minting, very little consideration, a lot of blind innovation, solutionism without any kind of conversations is frankly not really getting us anywhere. And if it does, it's usually a very almost a scenario where it's 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Or it's just, a very short-term solution. And if we are serious about the industry as a whole, then reflection, translation, consideration, contextualization, long-term thinking really needs to be key of everything that we're doing, because I think then is basically when we can really start to create foundations that holds a whole ecosystem rather than just the individual, and allow for that ecosystem to grow and flourish. So, where does the curator fit in within this kind of crazy narrative? So I think to bring it back to where I started, where the word curation comes from, with the meaning of care and concern. The care and concern that we're talking about is not just a simple act of caring any longer, though caring by all means is not simple. It's not a simple task. But I think caring is also something that's just much wider. The act of caring is definitely there, but I think it also means the act of reflecting, the act of translating, the act of contextualizing, the act of long-term thinking, the act of facilitating, the act of considering, the act of trusting, and so on. And I think this is what we need to keep in mind as we move forward with curation within the Web3 space. Thank you very much. And now it's time for questions.
Yes, I was going to invite everyone to ask questions. I'm sure you have them.
Complete silence.
I think it's a lot to unpack, I think it's a lot of thinking.
Yes, of course. Also, if you have any comments or anything, it doesn't need to be a question. It can also just be reflect. Maybe perhaps you've reflected upon something that you want to share.
Hi, this is Laila here, and you said reflected. It's a lot of unpack really, and as we went through it, it's I don't know if I have any questions, but reflections. I think in the NFT space, there's a lot of minting going on, and there's a lot of people just putting artwork almost every day. And then you said we have to reflect, we have to think, sort of put out your best work and don't rush. And I'm sort of translating for me to understand what you're saying. And I think that's key here. And when you first started, you said something that are crypto arts that are, but and I something like that. And I totally understood it because I keep on hearing people saying that they're NFT artists or crypto artists, and I just call myself a plain artist because it is, you're doing art. It doesn't matter where it is. And I have gotten some negative feedback on just for not taking the crypto artist title and just sticking to just artist. And I guess I'm still reflecting because I'm just going with a lot of so I think I leave it here. My brain is just going all over the place right now. Thank you so much. This is so much. I'm gonna watch it again because it's so much more to learn.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because I think that really actually corresponds with the way I think about it as well. Because I, like I said, I've worked as a curator for a long time. And not necessarily with NFT or Web3 or crypto art per se the whole time, but I usually get the question as well in terms of how do I work differently with NFTs? But I don't necessarily differentiate this kind of work that I do. I work with art, full stop. If it happens to be an NFT, yeah, sure, then I work with an NFT. But also, if I happen to work with a painting, then I work with a painting. So it's. I think this is also something that really corresponds with with my own thinking about my role as a curator. Is this kind of, I work with art. I'm a curator. I'm an art curator, full stop. I'm not an NFT curator or a Web3 curator or blockchain curator. Curator, that's what I am.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to say. Also, me, I just work with art, and it just happened to be an NFT. It's an NFT, and if it's a photography, it's a photograph, and if it's a painting, it's a painting. It's just art. I think most of us here, or all of us here, that's what we do with art.
So I'm just reading the chat here now. Ella, I see a question. Are there any other artists who are working between physical artworks and digital works that you're interested in? Oh, questions like this always put me on the spot. I always find them so hard to to answer, because I work with so many artists. It's always a great question. Can I think about it a bit, and I can share it in the chat instead? Would that be okay? Yes, I also want to say I'm also a one-on-one mentor. I've had some already absolutely amazing conversations with some of you already. I like reach out to me on Twitter or find me here or email, and just I'll send you across my Calendly link. And if you want to speak to me more in depth about your pieces or curation, or just nerd out about anything that has to do with curation, please